History tells the story of the world and of our lives. Sometimes that history goes bump in the night. Broadcasting from the center of oddity and the supernatural in Central Florida, it's the History Goes Bump podcast.
Hello, you spooktacular people. Welcome to this 577th episode of the History Goes Bump podcast. Ghost tours for the theater of the mind. I am your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
Kelly, on this episode, we're going to Fort McHenry. And do you know what this is the birthplace of?
Yes.
And what would that be?
The national anthem.
Yes. That's so awesome. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the fort and then our national anthem's birth and the ghosts that are all wrapped up in that.
Looking forward to it.
Before we get into that, we want to welcome into the spooktacular crew, Emily and Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for joining our Facebook group.
And now this moment in Oddity.
The moment in Oddity was suggested by Jim Featherstone. In the 1940s, during World War II, women began working in factories to support the war efforts due to many men having been deployed overseas. With 5 million women entering the workforce between 1940 and 1945, the American labor force at the time was 1/3 women. The types of jobs performed by these women varied, from working in munitions factories, aircraft and tank factories, shipbuilding, and many more. A good majority of these jobs involved working with heavy machinery. As one can imagine, a woman's long hairstyle could be quite dangerous while working around grinding gears. Then, in walks Veronica Lake.
Wowza.
She was a popular American film actress who was well known for her luscious locks and peekaboo hairstyle, having her hair partially covering one eye. Her hairstyle was iconic and was replicated by many women. Problem was, loose hair around heavy machinery could result in not only severe injury, but even death. Miss Lake was asked to make a film for the government about safety styles for women working in factories. In one photo, she's shown with her long hair tangled around a drill press. In a scene from the film, Veronica receives an updo hairstyle with no stray strands swinging in sight. Soon after, female factory workers adopted an even safer option. Full head caps were distributed to the factory workers, allowing the wearers to completely tuck their hair away. Actors and actresses have always influenced society, but a famous actress sporting a hairdo that shaped the war industry safety protocol certainly is odd.
Turn out the lights. The party's just getting started.
And now this month in history.
In the month of March, on the 1st, in 1932, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was kidnapped from his New Jersey home. The kidnapper entered the 20-month-old's nursery at approximately 9 p.m. The intruder used a homemade ladder to enter the second-story room. Muddy footprints were found, as well as a poorly spelled ransom note which was left on the windowsill of the nursery. There was also a symbol on the note which consisted of 2 intersecting circles and 3 holes. The note demanded $50,000, and shortly thereafter, parcels were sent to the Lindberghs which included pieces of baby clothing. The ransom money was delivered to an unknown man at St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx. The kidnapping received national news coverage and was dubbed the crime of the century. Sadly, Charles Lindbergh Jr.'s body was found 10 weeks later, just a couple miles from the Lindbergh home in a grove of trees in Hopewell, New Jersey, on May 12th. He was identified by his homemade undershirt, which had a missing piece that matched the remnant that was mailed to the Lindberghs in one of the parcels. The baby's father and nursemaid identified Charles Jr.'s body at the morgue. The kidnapping murderer was later identified as Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Hopman had used some of the ransom money to buy gas, and most of the remaining money was found in his garage. Hopman was found guilty of the kidnapping and murder in February 1935. He was put to death in the electric chair for his crime.
Fort McHenry sits in Baltimore's harbor and is probably best known as a site where America's national anthem was penned during the War of 1812. The Battle of Baltimore was fought here, with a relentless attack bearing down on the fort from the British. The assault was so harrowing, it's understandable how Francis Scott Key was inspired to write his poem. Today, spirits still linger from that era. Join us for the history and hauntings of Fort McHenry.
Whetstone Point in Baltimore was first home to Fort Whetstone, which was an earthen star-shaped fort. This served as a strategic defense of the harbor in Baltimore during the Revolutionary War. And in 1777, the flag that flew above the fort featured 7 red stripes, 6 white stripes, and 8 stars formed in a circle, with a 9th star in the middle of the circle, and stars in each of the 4 corners of a square blue field in the upper left corner. This was a very early version of the American flag. The position of the fort was far enough from the heart of the city to give effective security without endangering the city. Any enemy ship coming into the harbor would have to face an attack from the fort. Surprisingly, the fort had no attack on it during the Revolutionary War. Since the fort was fairly primitive, it was decided to replace it with a better fortification, and a French engineer named Jean Fontaine was asked to do just that in 1798. This new fort would also take on the new name of Fort McHenry in honor of James McHenry, who was the Secretary of War under President George Washington. He provided extensive support in the building of the fort.
Fort McHenry was designed as a bastioned pentagon, surrounded by a dry moat, and each bastion had a cannon. After the War of 1812 started, the fort was equipped with 18, 24, and 32-pounder cannons.
Oh, look at the big cannon.
Mort, step away from the cannon.
Hey, does anybody have a Zippo?
Mort!
Oh, shucks.
The Battle of Baltimore would be a defining moment in the War of 1812 and was fought on land and sea from September 12 to September 14, 1814. Preparations for war began at Fort McHenry in August when British expeditionary forces landed at Benedict, Maryland. The man in charge of the fort at the time was Major George Armistead. Armistead had been born in Virginia and began his military career in 1799 and served as an artillery officer at Fort Niagara in May 1813. His accomplishments there brought him to the command of Fort McHenry in June 1813. His first order there was to make a flag, quote, so large that the British will have no difficulty in seeing it from a distance.
I love that. I want to make sure they can see it from all over.
That's fitting, as he would later be known as the guardian of the Star-Spangled Banner.
The British had just burned Washington, D.C. in August of 1814. They had destroyed the U.S. Capitol, the White House, and other government buildings, making this the only time after the Revolutionary War that the U.S. Capitol was captured by a foreign force. The British were feeling confident, and they set their eyes on Baltimore. They were not aware that American merchant ships had been sunk at the entrance to the Baltimore harbor to prevent entry of ships. That was a really good idea. I'd never thought about that.
Absolutely.
The British Navy would have to fashion their attack as a bombardment from a distance. There were other British forces on land trying to make an assault on the interior of Baltimore, but the American militia forces surprised the British with their resilience. They did manage to outflank and overrun the American forces to the right, but the British knew that they couldn't endure a frontal assault. So they decided to put all their efforts into a naval fight.
On the morning of September 13, 1814, at 6 a.m., British Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane ordered the bombardment of Fort McHenry to begin. And that bombardment would last for 25 hours, ending at 4:30 a.m. on September 14, 1814. And then the national anthem would be born. Francis Scott Key was a 38-year-old lawyer from Georgetown when he found himself aboard a truce vessel under the guard of British ship HMS Surprise on September 14, 1814, writing a poem. Key had come to Baltimore from Washington, D.C. to procure the release of a doctor friend of his named William Beans, who had been arrested by the British during the burning of Washington. On September 7th, Key had earned the doctor's release by showing British Major General Robert Ross letters written by wounded British soldiers who had been helped by American doctors, including Dr. Beans. Key's rescue party was not allowed to leave the ship, however, because they had heard battle plans. They would have to wait until after the battle, but the British did let them reboard their truce vessel that was tethered to the HMS Surprise. Key spent the entire day of September 13th watching the bombardment of Fort McHenry, and he observed that the fort's small storm flag continued to fly under the onslaught. When darkness came, he could no longer see the flag, and thus he wouldn't know if the Americans still held the fort.
On the morning of September 14th, the storm flag was lowered and replaced with a large garrison flag. You know, that large one that...
See from a distance?
Yep.
Yeah.
This was a flag made by Mary Young Pickersgill, and I believe her 13-year-old daughter helped her as well. It had 15 stars and 15 stripes. When Key looked out at the fort in the morning and saw this flag flying, he was elated and inspired. Included in his poem were the rocket's red glare from HMS Erebus, and the bombs bursting in air from HMS Meteor, Terror, Devastation, Volcano, and Etna. I mean, the British really wanted you to fear their ships. Despite over 700 rockets and 1,800 bombs, that's what all hit that fort, and it stood, and they held it. Only 4 men and 1 woman died. Can you believe that?
That's amazing.
5 deaths, with another 24 wounded. Key's poem, Defense of Fort McHenry, would be printed as a broadside on September 17th. It later got national exposure through the Analectic magazine. The poem was set to the tune of the British song To Anacreon in Heaven and retitled The Star-Spangled Banner. There are 4 stanzas. I don't know how many people know that, but only the first one is sung and was first officially recognized by the Navy in 1889 as a national anthem. This would become official on March 3, 1931, when Congress passed a joint resolution that was signed by President Herbert Hoover. Francis Scott Key visited his hometown of Frederick, Maryland in 1834 and gave a speech about what inspired him to write the poem that became our national anthem. He said, "You have been pleased to declare your approbation of my song. Praise to a poet could not be otherwise than acceptable. But it is strangely gratifying to me to know that, in obeying the impulse of my own feelings, I have awakened yours. The song, I know, came from the heart, and if it has made its way to the hearts of men, whose devotion to their country and the great cause of freedom I know so well, I could not pretend to be insensible to such a compliment. You have recalled to my recollection the circumstances under which I was impelled to this effort. I saw the flag of my country waving over a city, the strength and pride of my native state, a city devoted to plunder and dissolution by its assailants. I witnessed the preparation for its assaults, and I saw the array of its enemies as they advanced to the attack. I heard the sound of battle. The noise of the conflict fell upon my listening ear, and told me that the brave and the free had met the invaders. Then did I remember that Maryland had called her sons to the defense of that flag, and that they were the sons of sires who had left their crimson footprints on the snows of the North, and poured out of the blood of patriots like water on the sands of the South. Then did I remember that there were gathered around that banner, among its defenders, men who had heard and answered the call of their country. From these mountainsides, from this beautiful valley, and from this fair city of my native country, and though I walked upon a deck surrounded by a hostile fleet, detained as a prisoner, yet was my step firm and my heart strong, as these recollections came upon me. Through the clouds of war, the stars of that banner still shone in my view, and I saw the discomforted host of its assailants driven back in ignominy to their ships. Then, in that hour of deliverance and joyful triumph, my heart spoke. And does not such a country and such defenders of their country deserve a song? Was its question. When it came an inspiration not to be resisted, and even though it had been a hanging matter to make a song, I must have written it. Let the praise then, if any be due, be given not to me, who only did what I could not help doing, not to the writer, but to the inspirers of the song. I again thank you for the honor you have done me, but I can only take the share of it. I was but the instrument in executing which you have been so pleased to praise. It was dictated and inspired by the gallantry and patriotism of the sons of Maryland. The honor is due not to me who made the song, but to the heroism of those who made me make it. I thought that was so cool how he put that. And he's like, it wasn't about me. I just put to word what I was watching happen around me, and I was so inspired.
And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors.
After the battle, President James Madison promoted Major Armistead to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and Armistead told his wife that, quote, he hoped they would both live long to enjoy. Unfortunately, that wouldn't be the case. Armistead only lived another 4 years, dying at the age of 38 from unknown causes. He was buried with full military honors. As for Fort McHenry, after the war, it was improved with expanded buildings and outer defenses were added. When the Civil War started, Baltimore was full of citizens who were pro-secession. The cannons at Fort McHenry were pointed in 2 different directions, one of which was toward the harbor in case of coastal attack, and the other, well, that was towards the center of Baltimore itself, to warn those pro-secessionists to get in line. The fort served as a prison for much of its time during the Civil War, and many of the prisoners came from the battles at Antietam and Gettysburg. There were also pro-secessionists from Maryland who could be arrested after President Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. This had people calling Fort McHenry the American Bastille.
It was decided during World War I to convert the fort into a large U.S. Army hospital. Dozens of buildings were added to the property to facilitate this endeavor, and then they were dismantled afterward. During World War II, the Coast Guard moved in and made the fort a base, and they used it for training. The fort was restored to the way it looked during the War of 1812, and part of it was opened at this time as a museum because in 1925, Fort McHenry was made a national park. It became a double designee in 1939 when it was designated a national monument and historic shrine. This is the only location in the United States to get this dual designation. Through the years, any new flag design has been flown above the fort first before it becomes official. The 49-star flag and 50-star flag are still located at Fort McHenry. Today, Fort McHenry is a tourist destination and has an award-winning living history volunteer unit. The flag that inspired Francis Scott Key still exists, but has deteriorated and is very fragile. For this reason, it has a special display case at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C.
Anybody who studies the history of forts knows that many of them have been star-shaped. For some, that star shape has an occult significance, and perhaps leads to some of the reports of paranormal activity. The interesting thing about what is technically known as the pentagram is that it also has Jewish and Christian significance too. In early Christianity, the pentagram was used to mark the 5 wounds of Christ on the cross. The pentagram itself goes all the way to ancient Sumeria and was found on pottery discovered in Ur. They used it as a symbol for the gods Ishtar and Marduk. In Judaism, the star is expanded into 2 full triangles with one inverted and was derived from the Seal of Solomon, created in medieval mystical traditions. Occultists embraced the pentagram as a magical symbol, particularly to depict spirit presiding over the 4 elements. The inverted pentagram was eventually deemed an evil symbol because this symbolized matter conquering spirit. Wicca embraced the pentagram and encircled it, creating the pentacle. While forts used the star shape because it allowed maximum defense capabilities without any dead zones, it is interesting to consider that the shape might inadvertently be powering some kind of other energy.
Yeah, because we know a lot of these forts supposedly are haunted, and I've often wondered, does it have something to do with its actual shape? Because we always like to look at the land when we're looking at hauntings. What was there originally? Is there some kind of energy in the land? And then the next thing you look at is the architecture. Is there something about the architecture and what something is built out of? Does any of that have anything to do with the haunting? Then we get into, did people die? Are there spirits here? That kind of thing. That's the way we've always done it here at History Goes Bump. We like to go from the ground up. So I thought it'd be interesting to look into. Does the star have anything to do with that? Maybe.
Definitely.
There are many stories about several entities haunting the grounds at Fort McHenry. Doors rattle and intense cold spots are felt. People have reported seeing spirits hanging from the former gallows. Many of the spirits seen are from the War of 1812, and they're seen walking the bricks. Soldiers from various eras are seen not only from the War of 1812, but also the Revolutionary War, Civil War, and World War I. And keep in mind, it was a hospital during World War I, so probably a lot of them might have died here. That woman who died during the Battle of Baltimore had her body torn in half by a rocket.
Oh, my word.
She is said to haunt the site and is seen as a woman missing half of her body. She wanders aimlessly as though looking for her other half. Now, this could be the woman in white that is seen as well, or this might be an entirely different ghost who was the wife of an officer whose children died in an epidemic here in the 1820s. She's said to push people downstairs and has even knocked a couple of people unconscious. One of those people was an artist who said he came through a doorway and felt like a frying pan hit him in the face before he went out cold.
Oh my gosh.
So one of the forest rangers was walking through and saw him collapsed on the floor, and once they got him to come to, it was like a frying. So he goes, something hit me in my face and knocked me out. And he goes, it felt like a frying pan. And they're like, well, there was nobody here, so.
Insane. Golly. The cool thing about ghost sightings at the fort is that usually a group of people all see the same thing. For instance, a group of reenactors all saw a female prisoner in a second-floor window. She was described as wearing a Victorian-era dress. No one is sure who she was, but probably a pro-secessionist. The jail is said to be very creepy, and it had a death row during the Civil War. There are claims that if you rub your hand along the wall, you will feel an abnormal warm spot.
There's another one of those weird ones. Every so often people claim there's a warm spot when there's a spirit nearby, not a cold spot.
First Call Paranormal was visiting in March of 2023 and walking around with a spirit box that said, person, right before somebody else came walking into the room. It was a rainy day and there was hardly anyone at the fort. It may have been nothing, but the guy said he thought it was interesting and wondered if he was being warned that a person was coming.
I'll go ahead and play that audio right here for you guys. And I've increased the part where the spirit box says person.
Is this where you slap? Can you tell me your name? So did they just warn me that a person was coming? Pretty interesting.
One of the more well-known spirits is said to belong to Private John Drew. He was a soldier who killed himself after being caught sleeping on duty. The shame seemed to be too much for him. Since he had been locked up for his infraction, he is often seen in the cell where he took his life. Sometimes he makes it out into the ramparts to the part where he was on guard duty. Lieutenant Levi Claggett is another spirit here. This is his obituary notice from September 21st, 1814. This afternoon at 4 o'clock, the Baltimore Artillery Company of Fencibles, under the command of Captain Joseph Hooper Nicholson, will parade for the purpose of rendering the last tribute of respect to Lieutenant Levi Claggett and Sergeant John Clem, who fell in defense of this city and their country's rights at Fort McHenry during the bombardment of that fortress by the enemy. To have fallen in such a cause would have, of itself, entitled the memory of the dead to respect and sympathy. But they needed no such adventitious circumstances to excite the most poignant regret at their untimely departure. They formed a prominent part of the rich price which was paid for victory and safety. In civil life, they were men of the most amiable manners, honorable principles, and respectable standing in society. In the hour of danger, they evinced ardent and collected courage. Their friends lament their loss with sorrow not loud but deep. May the reflection that they died in a cause and at a time when every tongue was eloquent in their praise, that they departed in the path of honor, that the gratitude of their countrymen will embalm their names in every heart, afford to the bereaved of their connections and friends the only alleviation for such a loss. Their brethren in arms will cherish their memory with affectionate care. They sleep on the soldier's bed, the bed of honor, and while their loss may call forth the manly tear of fraternal regret, their example will animate to deeds such as living they would have approved and aided. People claim his apparition can be seen walking or floating around the fort. He's been seen as both a translucent figure and a regular-looking uniformed man, often mistaken as a reenactor. His favorite spot to haunt is Claggett's Bastion, where he died. I guess one of the rockets hit it and blew it up, and that's where both of them were inside. So if you think about it, they were just 2 of the 5 people that were killed. Incredibly, the Secret Service had been sweeping the fort and preparing it for a visit from President Gerald Ford, and they spotted a uniformed soldier walking the same bastion where Claggett and Clem died. There was supposed to be no costume people or visitors on the property during this preparation, so the agents were left to wonder if they had just seen a ghost. It's pretty good when you have the Secret Service seeing it, because you're like, they're not going to make that stuff up. And they probably were running after it going, hey,
I'm sure.
there's not supposed to be anybody here.
Southern Spirit Guide website reports, one of the more interesting experiences reported on the grounds of the fort comes from near a large statue of Orpheus honoring Francis Scott Key. The large statue stands on the grounds outside the fort, and it was here that one visitor saw the figure of a man in uniform seemingly floating in mid-air. It was discovered later that that particular area had been the scene of an execution in 1862. A young private had been found guilty of murdering another soldier, and it was here that he made his air dance. In other words, he was hanged.
That'd be creepy to see that. Wow. America's Haunted Road Trip website reports, one ghost hunting group that recently visited the site is the Maryland Tri-State Paranormal. Founder Anna Bruder told me that while they were there, her friend Laura suddenly said, "I feel like I'm being watched." Anna, who's sensitive to the presence of spirits, turned and saw the ghost of a uniformed soldier staring at her friend, just one of several spirits she detected while at the site. That's kind of creepy when somebody goes, "I feel like I'm being watched," and she turns around and goes, "Yep, you sure are."
Fort McHenry is famously known as the birthplace of America's national anthem. It is fitting that a place that revealed so much American spirit and fortitude should have actual spirits walking around. Is Fort McHenry haunted?
That is for you to decide. Cool place. Well, if we ever make it to Maryland, I definitely want to go there because I just love the history that's involved here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Irregardless of the hauntings, it would just be really cool to be at the place where the national anthem was born. And I was tempted to say, hey, let's go ahead and sing the national anthem so, everybody hears the words. But, I thought, wow, us
Maybe
trying
not.
to sing that song.
Yeah, maybe not.
That's the only thing. I'm like, hey, I don't know who decided to put it to that British tune. But I'm like, could have you picked something that wasn't like a soprano with those really high notes? Because all of America tries to sing that song, and there's very few people that can do a good job with that. That's why we hoot and holler when somebody can actually hit those notes, because we're like, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, definitely. Gives you chills.
Something we'd love for all of you to hit is our website, historygoesbump.com. And if you'd like to leave us some feedback, you can do that at historygoesbump@gmail.com or at any of our various social media or over at YouTube. Please leave us any reviews.
And if you've had any personal experiences that you want to share with the show, send us an email.
We did hear from Amanda, who wrote under Haunted Wall Street on YouTube. Fascinating episode. It is so hard for me to wrap my head around just how old some places in America are and just how deep its history is. Also, I'm very intrigued about the bog butter.
Ew.
LOL, I have 2 milk cows and make butter several times a week. To think that butter had been preserved for hundreds of years in a bog is amazing. It is pretty amazing. Gross, but amazing indeed. And I could not believe, Haunted Wall Street was just one of those things that I just kind of pulled out of my backside, I guess you could say.
Oh, boy.
So I'm like, I wonder if that's haunted over there. I would love to know. And then I found that guy's book, and and it's been a very popular episode. I was actually surprised. So I want to thank you for joining us on this episode. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This episode is brought to you by our executive producers.
Join me in the cemetery by becoming an executive producer. You can join on Patreon or PayPal. Check out the Support the Show tab on the website for more information.
types of jobs performed by these women varied from working in munitions. The types of jobs. My mouth is cold from my coffee.
Okay, icy mouth.
The types of jobs performed.
It is hard to talk when you have numb mouth. In the month of March, on the 1st, in 1932, Charles Augustus Lindbergh
Limburger and cheese.
Yeah, I would like a little bit of cheese with that.
It's smelly.
Driven back in ignominy. Ignominy?
I don't know. Ignominy.
Ignominy.
And many of the prisoners came from the battles of Anthem. Anthem.